Have you ever just stopped and wondered why our world seems so starkly divided between the rich and the poor? It's a huge question, and it pretty much defines our modern world. Well, today, we're going to unpack the really deep-seated reasons behind all this global inequality. So, let's kick things off with a couple of numbers. First up, 77%. That's the share of the entire world's population that lives in what we call the global south. Just let that number sink in for a second. Okay, now for the second number, just 15%. That's the tiny slice of global income that massive majority of people actually holds. The difference between those two numbers? It's just staggering, right? So how did we get here? This incredible disparity leads us right to the central question we're going to explore. How on earth did our world get so fundamentally divided? And maybe more importantly, what's keeping it that way? All right, to really get a handle on this, we've got to start with the basics. Let's make sure we're all on the same page with the terms. Now, the first thing you need to know is that global north and global south aren't strictly about geography. I mean, look at Australia and New Zealand. They're obviously in the southern hemisphere, but they're considered part of the global north. So what gives? Well, it's really a socioeconomic and political line that separates the more developed, wealthier economies from the developing ones. It's a framework to help us understand these huge gaps in wealth and power. You know, one of the first attempts to really show this divide was something called the Brandt line, way back in 1980. It was a simple idea. Just draw a conceptual line across a map of the world, separating the rich north from the poor south. The world's definitely more complicated now, but that image really captured the stark reality of the time. And let's be clear, this division didn't just happen by accident. Not at all. It was built over centuries, and to get the full picture, we have to look back to its colonial roots. So how did this all play out? Well, the age of colonialism created massive global empires. Then the Industrial Revolution kicked off, leading to what historians call the Great Divergence, this huge split in wealth between the new industrial nations and everyone else. And even after colonies gained independence after World War II, the basic economic setup often stayed locked in place. And at the absolute heart of this were something called extractive institutions. It's a key term. Basically, these colonial economies were never, ever designed to build up prosperous local societies. Their one main job was to pull out natural resources and cheap labor and send all that wealth back home to the colonizing country. So what you ended up with was this global division of labor, a pattern that, honestly, is still very much with us today. The South became the go-to place for exporting low-cost raw materials. Think coffee, minerals, cotton, while having to import expensive manufactured goods from the North. It's a setup that pretty much locks in economic disadvantage from the start. Okay, so that's the history. But how do experts explain why these patterns are so hard to change? Well, there are a couple of big competing theories out there that try to make sense of it all. On one side, you've got what's called modernization theory. It basically argues that countries in the global south are behind because they haven't adopted modern technology, institutions, and values. But on the complete opposite side, you have dependency theory. It says the system itself is the problem, that the North's wealth was built and is still maintained on the economic exploitation of the South. All right, let's zoom in on dependency theory for a second because it's a really powerful way of looking at this. It sees the global economy as having a wealthy core and a poorer periphery. In this view, resources, money, and labor are constantly flowing from the periphery to the core. This makes the core nations richer while trapping the periphery in a cycle of dependence that's incredibly hard to break out of. Okay, we've talked history, we've talked theory, but what does this inequality actually look like in the real world right now? Let's turn to the data and see how we can measure this gap. The main tool economists use for this is called the Gini coefficient. Now, it sounds complicated, but the idea is super simple. It's just a score from 0 to 1. 0 means perfect equality. Everybody has the exact same amount. 1 means total inequality. One person has absolutely everything. It's a neat way to get a snapshot of how wealth is spread out. And when you look at the data, you find something really fascinating. Sure, a global south country like Brazil shows extremely high inequality. But then, look at the USA, a leader of the global north. Its score is also incredibly high, way higher than Germany's. Then you have a place like Slovakia with a much more even distribution. This tells us that huge economic inequality isn't just a north-south thing. It's also a massive issue inside of countries, including the richest ones.
And when you see it on a chart like this, it just jumps right out at you, doesn't it? The difference between the high inequality in Brazil and the low score in Slovakia is just vast. It really highlights a key point. The North-South divide is a powerful lens, for sure, but extreme inequality at home is also a defining feature for so many countries around the world.
So, that brings us to a huge question. If colonialism is in the past, why is this divide still so persistent and massive today? Let's break down the modern-day reasons that keep these patterns going. Well, a whole bunch of things keep this system chugging along. For starters, those old trade imbalances are still a thing. Then you've got crushing debt burdens that just cripple development. The global north still holds most of the power in big financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. There are also unfair trade policies, like huge farm subsidies in the US and Europe that make it almost impossible for farmers in the South to compete. And finally, there's the brain drain, where the best and brightest often leave the South for opportunities in the North. And we have to talk about something really controversial: structural adjustment programs, or SAPs. For a long time, if countries wanted to get loans from the IMF or World Bank, they were forced to follow these strict policies, which often meant slashing spending on essentials like healthcare, education, and infrastructure. Critics argue these programs just made poverty and dependency even worse. But here's the thing: the story isn't over. This isn't a static picture. The world is changing, and fast. So what does the future of all this look like? That simple line we drew on the map earlier, it's getting a lot blurrier. You've got these incredible emerging economies totally changing the game and shifting the global balance of power. And we're seeing this huge rise in what's called South-South cooperation, where developing nations are trading and investing with each other, creating new pathways to growth that don't rely on the North. And people are really fighting to bridge this gap. You see it on so many fronts. At the highest levels, you've got things like the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. From the ground up, you have powerful movements for things like climate justice and fair trade demanding real systemic change. And there are increasingly loud calls for widespread debt relief to finally break that historical cycle. So, at the end of the day, it all boils down to this one massive question. With new economic giants rising and powerful movements pushing for change, are we finally on the verge of a more equitable world? Or are the economic patterns built over hundreds of years just too powerful to overcome? The answer to that is really going to be the story of our time.